Chapter 1. A Midnight Customer. It was in the last days of October of the year 1893 that the singular adventure of the lantern that shone without a flame first came to my attention. A case so curious, so different from the ordinary crimes of men, that even now, as I put pen to paper, I cannot think of it without a feeling mingled with fear and wonder. Holmes and I had rested by the fire in Baker Street that evening. The air outside was acrid, driven by an east wind, and the fog, thick as a woolen curtain, pressed against the windows, so that the street lamps appeared only as blurry orange halos in the darkness. I had brought some papers from my study, and Holmes, as always, had been carrying on with his chemical experiments. A faint smell of sulphur hung in the air, mingled with that of his pipe, which he puffed on with great pleasure. "You see, Watson," he said, holding up a glass vial to the light, "the smallest stain can reveal volumes. This brown mark, perhaps to your eyes the mere result of spilled coffee, contains the very story of a man's life, his habits, his vices, his deepest secrets, all waiting to be read by someone who knows the alphabet." He smiled faintly, and I understood that he was speaking less to instruct me than to amuse himself. It was his usual way of concealing his overflowing energy beneath such digressions. We had barely settled into this comfortable idleness when there was a knock at the door, a hurried, uneven, and insistent knock. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man whose pallor and agitation betrayed extreme distress. He was middle-aged, his frock-coat disheveled, his hat clutched convulsively in his hands. "I beg your pardon for this intrusion at such a late hour," he stammered, "but I have been told, no, assured, that only Mr. Sherlock Holmes can help me in my peril." Holmes had stood up, his piercing eyes fixed on the visitor with that hawk-like intensity I knew so well. "Please sit down," he said. "Your name?" "Percival Henning, sir. I am employed by the Metropolitan Gas Company." Holmes inclined his head, signaling him to continue. "I'm not talking about murder or theft or any crime known to Scotland Yard," Henning said in a low voice, although the door was closed. "It's an unnatural thing. There's a lantern in our company warehouse in Shoreditch that burns without oil, without a wick, without a flame, and yet it casts a pale and terrible light, such as none of us can explain." I admit I let out a little laugh. The poor boy was clearly at his wit's end, but Holmes didn't smile. "Did you see it yourself?" "Indeed, sir, and what's more, last night a guard died nearby." At these words Holmes's expression deepened. "Dead? How?" "Without injury or mark, save for an expression of horror on his face, enough to unsettle even the bravest. His lantern was broken, yet that other light, the one I speak of, still shone fixed and cold on the ground." Holmes took a deep breath and sank back in his chair, his fingers clenched. I observed that the features of his face, so often marked by their composure, betrayed a slight tremor of excitement. "You did well to come and see me, Mr. Henning. Scotland Yard would call you an idiot or worse. But tell me, why aren't you a suspect yourself?" "Because, Mr. Holmes, I wasn't there. I only discovered the body this morning, and with it that damned device. My superiors ordered me to keep quiet about it, for fear of alarming public opinion, but I couldn't bear the thought. Please come to Shoreditch, see it for yourself." The man's voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands.
Holmes stood up and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Restore your composure. Your wish will be granted. Watson, go and fetch your coat. We'll go immediately." The fog was even thicker when we hailed a taxi, Henning beside us, in a silence broken only by his anxious breathing. The wheels clattered on the wet cobblestones, and the lampposts of the Strand glowed like ghosts in the darkness. I glanced at Holmes, sitting bolt upright, chin jutting forward, his eyes shining with that inner fire that burned whenever a mystery worthy of his powers presented itself. "Holmes," I ventured, "surely you don't believe the story of that man on a flameless lantern?" "My dear Watson," he replied, "I believe in nothing. I observe. Until I have observed, I refrain from making any judgment. But know this well, phenomena considered impossible have thus far turned out to be simply misunderstood. The boundary between science and superstition is only the extent of a single fact. Shoreditch at midnight is not a cheerful prospect. The streets were almost deserted, save for a few unfortunate souls huddled against walls and the distant clatter of a policeman's baton. Our taxi turned into a narrow alley, and we stopped in front of a long, low brick building with iron shutters on its windows. "This is the warehouse," Henning said in a voice barely louder than a whisper. He opened the heavy door, and we went in. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of gas and petroleum. Henning led us down an aisle of crates and cylinders until we finally reached a space marked off by a rope. There, on the wooden planks, lay a circle of sawdust blackened by a spilled substance. An ordinary-looking lantern lay in pieces, as if violently thrown to the ground. But that was not where Holmes's gaze was drawn, nor mine. For there, on a crate in the center of this enclosed space, stood another lantern, unlike any I had ever seen. Its casing was made of brass, but without a chimney or any opening. From within it emitted a constant cold bluish glow, giving off neither smoke nor flicker nor heat. The shadows it cast stretched across the walls, long and grotesque. Henning crossed himself. "You see, gentlemen, it burns without a flame." Holmes approached slowly, his face unreadable. He bent down, held his hand out in front of the light, then withdrew it. "Curious," he murmured, "really curious." At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed on the planks behind us. We turned around, and in the strange light of the lantern, I saw a tall figure, a man in a construction guard's uniform with a somber face. "You have no right here," he grumbled. "Get out, or you'll share the fate of the last fool who touched this thing." Chapter 2, where Holmes averts his gaze to see more clearly. The intruder's warning, spoken in a hoarse voice that the unholy glow of the lantern made even sinister, had scarcely left his lips when Holmes, with that dry urbanity that he could assume at any moment, inclined his head as if receiving a polite greeting at the door of a drawing-room. "Your zeal is commendable," he said, "but we are here at the invitation of Mr. Percival Henning, whose authority, I presume, is as valid as yours for this inspection." Henning had shrunk behind me at the appearance of the guard, but at Holmes's words he recovered, straightened his back, and produced a small set of keys as if they were a badge of office. "This gentleman is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I am a clerk for the Metropolitan Gas Company, and this warehouse, Barker's Yard, Shoreditch, is under my responsibility for the night." The nose's expression did not soften. He was a thin man with a bristling mustache and curiously sunken eyes. The dim lantern light accentuated his features, making him look more sculpted than human. He wore the rough, brass-numbered leather of the company guards, and his boots, I couldn't help noticing, were covered in a peculiar greyish mud, uncommon on London pavements. "Holmes or no Holmes," he murmured, "there's no point in looking at the devil's toys. I found Tom Bridger as cold as a haddock next to that thing, and I won't risk another accident." "Were you on duty last night?" asked Holmes, still gentle, still courteous. "I was, and I will be again. Where there is danger, you need men, but I refuse to let foreigners get involved." Holmes's hand fluttered like a bird when he spotted an open window. His gaze, which a moment ago had rested with unfathomable attention on the man's boots, now fell on the luminous device resting on the crate. I had thought it a lantern, the word had so coloured my imagination, but the shape resembled a metal box less than a lantern. Its casing was made of brass, but without a chimney or any opening. From within it emitted a constant cold bluish glow, giving off neither smoke nor flicker nor heat. The shadows it cast stretched across the walls, long and grotesque. Henning crossed himself. "You see, gentlemen, it burns without a flame." Holmes approached slowly, his face unreadable. He bent down, held his hand out in front of the light, then withdrew it. "Curious," he murmured, "really curious." At that moment the sound of footsteps echoed on the planks behind us. We turned around, and in the strange light of the lantern I saw a tall figure, a man in a construction guard's uniform with a sombre face. "You have no right here," he grumbled. "Get out, or you'll share the fate of the last fool who touched this thing."
He knelt down and reached his hand, palm down, through the beam. "Watson," he said, "you notice there's no sensation of heat, but breathe in gently. Yes, there, a faint scent. Notice it." I leaned over, sniffed, and smelled a subtle metallic odor, not very different from that which is given off when you bite into a green winter lozenge, but harder, more vivid, and yet curiously clean. "Ozone," murmured Holmes, half to himself, "or something like that. It's a clever toy, and clever toys are rarely harmless in the hands of unimaginative men." The guard groaned. "Devil's breath," he said. Holmes's eyes rested on him again. "Your name?" "Cobb, Matthew Cobb." "And you, Mr. Henning, who found the body, at what time?" Henning clasped and unclasped his hands. 6 o'clock in the morning, sir. The day watch has taken over. I arrived early to take inventory. There had been complaints about missing brass fittings. I found poor Bridger there, on his back, his eyes. He swallowed. "As I told you, sir, they were wide open with terror, and that thing, that shining thing beside him." "Show me where the body is." Henning stepped into the delimited space and pointed to a dark, sawdust-covered oval on the boards, 1.5 meters from the light. Holmes crouched down, raised his magnifying glass to his eye, and examined the perimeter of the stain. He pricked it here and there with a steel point, then poured a pinch into his envelope. He did not yet approach the metal box any closer than a cautious step allowed. "Did your zeal, Cobb, go so far as to disrupt the scene?" asked Holmes without looking up. "I wouldn't dare touch that," the man said, "or Bridger. I called the police to the court, as is the rule." "And they came and went?" "They've arrived," Henning said, giving me a sympathetic look. "Inspector MacDonald, a newcomer. He took copious notes, asked few questions, and finally declared, oh, Mr. Holmes, that the man died of an epileptic seizure. He ordered the remains removed and the case closed, as if a human soul were a ledger entry to be moved to the next page." Holmes's thin lips curled. A crisis is an admirable solution when no other can be grasped. Please don't blame the inspector. He has the misfortune of having to make a decision in a world where wits are scarce." He stood up, dusted off his knee, and took from his pocket the long, delicate pencil with which I had seen him sketch a crime with more vividness than any artist. He made a quick sketch on the back of a card case, placed the card on the register, and remained motionless for a moment, as if listening to it. "Watson," he said, "you will please an old friend by taking 2 turns around the aisle and then telling me what I have just learned." I knew the game. He often subjected me to it, like a benevolent tutor imposing on a slow pupil a sum that is just too expensive for him. I walked along the nearest aisle, where crates of pipe and lead clamps were stacked in neat rows, then returned by the next aisle, where cylinders, empty as far as I knew, were bound with iron. "The floor is unusually clean," I ventured to say, upon my return, "for a warehouse, and there's a draft, perhaps coming in through the door." Holmes's eyes twinkled. "Quite right. What else?" I confess I hesitated. The dim light, the smell, the presence of the men, it all unsettled me, like a sudden cannonade can unsettle a soldier who's faced musket fire his whole life. I said something stupid about a broken nail in a crate lid, and simply calmed myself down. "Courage, my dear friend," said Holmes kindly. "You have observed the essential and missed the trivial. It is for me to observe the trivial in which the essential is hidden. For example, Cobb's boots." The guard moved and gritted his teeth. "And my boots?" "They aren't covered in Shoreditch mud, a reddish-brown from the neighborhood's brick dust, but in a gray, slightly micaeic clay, like that which is found along the River Lee, beyond Hackney Marsh. The grooves on the instep where the laces cross remember the gravel on a river path. You went there today, very recently in fact, because the clay is still damp and hasn't cracked yet." Cobb stared at him, a mixture of brooding admiration and suspicion in his eyes. "What if I did it?" "So perhaps you've met a man with a limp on his right leg, who smokes Cavendish and carries a cane with a horn tip. He's not a working man, because his handkerchief is linen and has been recently washed with violet salts. Cough, Cobb, don't drink. He might have asked you for directions to the company's drain pipe." Cobb's weathered face tightened. "I don't know how you do it," he murmured, "but there was such a gentleman. He spoke softly. He said he drew the lights of the marshes." Holmes's face became, for a moment, as still as the brass cylinder before us. "Swamp lights indeed." He turned to Henning. "Mr. Henning, does your company dispose of used reagents from your meter room? Chlorides, perhaps, metallic salts?" Henning blushed. "There's a sink in the back. It empties into the yard drain. The restoration department has been economical with its contracts." "Economical," repeated Holmes, as if relishing the word. "And some gentlemen draw marsh lights à la Lee. Watson, do you remember the blue fire we saw at Professor Croft's demonstration? Geisler's tube, how it sang in the air and caused a slight pricking in the nose." I remembered it. The image of that glass coil bathed in a strange light came back to me with a surge of emotion. The parallel immediately struck Henning, whose mouth opened slightly. "You mean electricity, Mr. Holmes?" he murmured. "I don't want to say anything, not for the moment," replied Holmes almost dryly. "I only observe that our well-intentioned friend, despite his outward modesty, may be the recipient of a more modern trick than gas. The world is changing, Mr. Henning, and he who sells light by the cubic meter will one day find himself competing with those who sell it by the spark. Your enterprise is not without rivals." Henning's fingers gripped the keys until they clicked into place. "You think we've been sabotaged by the power company? They don't—" "Men do what their interest and imagination allow," said Holmes. "In this case, I merely suspect the imagination of one man. He had a reason for introducing his glowworm into your shed. It remains to be seen whether that reason was curiosity, malice, or profit." He had advanced step by step toward the device, always keeping to himself against the faint metallic emanation we had both detected. With a deft flick of his knife, he scraped a thin sliver from the equatorial seam, retrieved it onto a card, and wrapped it up. Then, kneeling, he brought his cheek within inches of the brass and observed. I saw the fine hairs on his temple twitch. There's a jolt, not of heat, but of charge. Silence. He raised a finger. In the silence of the warehouse, the distant city echoed like the sea. Then, was it a figment of my imagination, I heard a very low whine, like the song of a mosquito. Holmes gave a thin smile. "It's a coil making that. A coil or a leak." Cobb swore under his breath, a murmured prayer disguised as blasphemy. "I told you so. The devil's breath." "Your piety, Cobb, is appreciated, but I prefer the devil I can tear to pieces." He stood up and finally addressed the practical questions which, I knew, were at the heart of his thoughts. "Mr. Henning, who else but you has the keys to this warehouse?" "The superintendent, Mr. Abel Quaint, the reception foreman, a German named Vogel, the guards on duty, Cobb, Bridger, and a young man, Thomas Bell, who relays messages. And among them is there a man who has a grievance?" Henning hesitated. He looked at Cobb, then at the floor. "There have been rumors, insufficient stock. A man was selling accessories outside of business hours. Bridger had complained, and there was talk of an employee from an electrical company visiting Vogel privately." Cobb jerked his head up. "That's slander," he said, but even as he spoke, he refused to meet Henning's gaze. "Name the company," Holmes said. Henning wrung his hands. "I don't know. Only this man spoke with a Scottish accent and looked like a lecturer." "Ah," and the monosyllable uttered on that flat note indicated to me that he had let another card slip into the hidden order of his deck. He slammed his suitcase shut. "We've inspected enough for tonight. Watson, the fog is lifting. Your patients will begin to believe the Thames has seeped in if you stay out too late. Mr. Henning, you will do exactly as I say. Post Cobb at the outside door and let no one into this room. Keep the luminous object intact. It will be safer here than in any police safe for the time being. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock you will visit Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard and tell him that Mr. Sherlock Holmes wishes you to meet you at this warehouse. Do not mention coils, lanterns, ozone, or anything else. Speak only of irregularities in the inventory and a death that bears no trace of a seizure. If he hesitates, appeal to his curiosity, which is stronger than his skepticism." Henning nodded quickly. Yes, Mr. Holmes." Cobb shuffled his boots, grim but obedient. If he hated the idea of standing guard for what he feared, he gave no sign of it. Holmes, whose respect for courage remained as keen as ever, shared his contempt for stupidity, and gave the man a brief nod, which I believe comforted him more than any words. We entered the night. The fog had lifted, forming a gauze through which the lampposts floated like gentle planets. A cold wind swept through the alley and fluttered a few grimy banners on the eaves. Our cab was waiting for us, the horse smoking faintly, its withers damp from the night's work. As we advanced, I could no longer hold back my questions. "Holmes," I exclaimed, "you can't possibly mean that this strange glow killed the guard." "I mean," he replied, "that a man lies dead, and beside him a machine that neither Henning nor Cobb can account for. When you find a man with a poker beside him, you don't necessarily stop the poker. The question isn't what, but who. Yet," and there his gaze drifted away, "a coil that sings in the night, a whisper of ozone, a seamless metal box. Watson, there's ingenuity here, and ingenuity means a mobile. We'll find it alive among men as surely as we found the trembling in the copper." He sank into silence, which I've learned to respect as fertile ground where his conclusions develop unseen. Yet even in this silence he was busy. His long fingers moved on his knees as if he were playing a piano without keys. Once he leaned forward to observe the city lights through the muddy taxi window. Another time he sniffed and made a small sound of satisfaction, as if a trace of the warehouse had adhered to his wrist. "You made an observation about Cobb which, I confess, surprised me," I said finally. "The gentleman with the cough, the violet salts, the horn ferule." "Elementary," said Holmes, not without kindness. "The horn ferule scratches, not dent. It leaves a slight scratch on the lever when a man rises to speak. Cobb's left shin bore such a scratch. As for Cavendish, the sweet, insipid scent clings to the hair, and Cobb's cap was no innocent. The handkerchief, linen, wears its creases and retains its scents in a way that cotton cannot imitate. And as for violet salts, my nose is as familiar with the most affordable comforts of the London pharmacist as your hand is with a pulse. And the blood? A slight trace of rust in the fold. It taught me nothing more than the state of our draughtsman's health. But in poor health a man will seek a different occupation than that of a vigorous scoundrel. He might be an instrument in more subtle hands. I shook my head, smiled, and leaned back, warmed by the familiar feeling of being a passenger on a ship whose infallible pilot was my friend. Yet, despite this comfort, a touch of unease lingered. There had been something, not in the glow, nor the smell, nor the watchman's irritability, but in the way Henning had spoken of shortages and a snoring visitor. The worlds of gas and electric wires were drawing closer as Shoreditch, and between the two, I imagined, a man could be crushed. We returned to Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson had reserved a dish of kidneys for our late dinner. Holmes ate little. He took his violin out of its case, tuned it carefully, and then, rather than launch into one of his riled pagan flourishes, played a tune so simple and sweet that the fog outside seemed to stop at the window to listen. It was an old Scottish melody, Care the Ewes, and I understood that he had that tune in his head. Before we parted for the night, he gathered a small set on the mantelpiece, the envelope with sawdust, the card with its brass shavings, a strip of litmus paper that he had gently blackened with a flame, and his sketch of the can with several dimensions noted in that tiny and precise handwriting that a clerk might envy. "One last thing, Watson," he said as I picked up my candle. "You've noticed the draught in the warehouse. The door leaks, but so do the men. When we leave tomorrow, don't focus your attention on the brightest object in the room. The eye is a fool to a lantern." "You mean?" "I simply want to say this. Observe the faces when Lestrade arrives. A law-abiding man flinches at his scent. Then we will determine whether that gleam is the cause or a cover." On this indirect advice he dismissed me. I slept little. The image of that cold and unwavering light kept returning, hovering at the edge of my dreams like a will-o'-the-wisp, attracting, warning, promising nothing. In the grayness of the morning I got up and found Holmes already at his workbench, sleeves rolled up, hair disheveled, an expression of austere satisfaction on his thin features. He had stained the brass shavings with a product that left a pale ring on the map. "Good," he murmured. "Not pure brass, then, a plating, and under, we'll see." He glanced at the clock. "Get dressed, Watson. We're going to see Lestrade. If fate is punctual today, he'll meet us in Shoreditch at noon, and we'll make the acquaintance of Mr. Abel Quaint, Herr Vogel, and all those who have been selling light after hours." Thus the case, which had begun with a fireless glow, progressed towards the more human illumination that the presence of Scotland Yard is likely to cast on the shadows of a mystery, an illumination that dazzles some, reveals others, and often leaves the truth undisturbed in the darkness, waiting for Holmes to name it.
Chapter 3. Lestrade, a German superintendent and foreman. We had scarcely broken our fast when Holmes ushered me into a cab with such swiftness that I barely had time to tie my cravat. His long limbs folded down beside me, his gaze fixed beyond the morning mist with that air of predatory patience that heralded an imminent hunt. The sound of the wheels had not carried us far before he leaned forward, fingers clasped, and observed in a particularly detached tone, "The question is always, Watson, whether to let the river carry the driftwood to its net, or to let the current carry it and retrieve it ourselves. Today we're going to do both." I had learned from long experience that such oracular pronouncements deserved silence rather than questioning, and so I contented myself with a quick glance at the morning paper. The only noteworthy item was a report of a burglary in Clerkenwell, during which a safe was stolen. The jeweler's shop had been opened without the slightest trace of violence. This seemed to me irrelevant to our mission, yet Holmes's eyes scanned the page, paused for a moment on the paragraph, then returned to the outside fog without comment. Scotland Yard arrive. We arrived at Barker's Yard a few minutes before noon. The large warehouse was as dark and menacing as the night, though the daylight now revealed its cracked bricks and rust-stained utters. Cobb, still in his guard uniform, stood watch at the outer gate, his jaw clenched as if he were expecting a blow. He touched his cap and let us in without a word. Inside, we found Mr. Henning in conference with Inspector Lestrade, whose slender figure and angular features were as familiar to me as they are to any reader of these chronicles. He greeted us with his usual mixture of courtesy and skepticism. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "I am brought back to Shoreditch on your recommendation. I hope this isn't another one of your magic lanterns and ghostly footsteps. Scotland Yard has no time to waste on phosphorescent toys." Holmes inclined his head with a smile. "You always embody healthy doubt, Inspector. Yet in this particular case, the toy killed a man." Lestrade sniffed, adjusted his handcuffs, and turned to Henning. "This gentleman informs me that a night watchman died here, Tom Bridger, wasn't he, and that you suspect foul play. The doctor who examined the body found heart failure. Do you dispute that?" Henning's thin lips trembled. "Yes, sir, I saw her face. It may have been an epileptic seizure, but what kind of seizure leaves the air foul and a light shining where there shouldn't be any?" At these words, Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "A light?" Holmes gestured toward the enclosure encircled by ropes. Even in broad daylight, the brass box still emitted its strange glow, pale as a winter moonlight and steady as a star. Lestrade's usual composure wavered for a moment. He gave a soft laugh that did little to conceal his unease. "Well, I swear, I've seen many strange things, Mr. Holmes, but never one that glittered without even a single strand. What kind of devilry is this?" "No devilry, Mr. Holmes. It's a mechanism. And the mechanism is merely a tool of men. That's the problem we're dealing with." The superintendent. At that moment, another figure entered, accompanied by the clatter of his cane on the floor. It was Mr. Abel Quaint, manager of the Shoreditch branch of the gas company, a stout man with a bright face and sideburns trimmed to the regulation height of respectability. His wide waistcoat strained at the buttons, and his demeanor was tinged with a mixture of swagger and unease. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he cried, "what's going on? Henning, you were told to keep it secret. And you, sir," he turned to Lestrade, "what right does Scotland Yard have over our warehouse?" "The right to an unexplained death, Mr. Quaint," Holmes replied, before Lestrade could speak. "If your interests are at stake, blame less the law than the circumstances that brought it about." Quaint's eyes fell upon the glowing cylinder, and I saw his cheeks turn pale. "It should never have been left here," he muttered. "The council will be furious." "Ah," said Holmes softly, "so the council is aware." The superintendent jumped, then coughed. "I simply mean that such devices give us a bad reputation. Our rivals will seize the opportunity to mock our science." "Rivals, Mr. Quaint?" asked Holmes, with deceptive nonchalance. "The Electricity Board, of course. They boast about wires and dynamos as if gas-lighting were a gimmick. Bah! A sham and a danger at the same time." Holmes said nothing, but I saw the gleam in his eyes.
Monsieur Vogel. The next arrival was Herr Vogel, the German foreman. He was a short, square-shouldered man of middle age, with close-cropped hair and a manner that was both respectful and reserved. His English was precise, tinged with a Teutonic accent that lent his words a certain gravity. "You wish to question me, gentlemen," he said. "I will answer what I know. Poor Bridger was a good fellow. He may have had enemies, but not here." "Enemies?" Lestrade caught the word. Vogel spread his hands. "He drank too much. He spoke too loudly. But he was honest. That's why he's, as you say, no longer alive." Holmes looked at him questioningly. "You speak as if his honesty had cost him dearly." Vogel's eyes flickered, then lowered. "I know nothing, Mr. Holmes, only that he complained of shortages. He said the books didn't match the crates. That's all." Holmes at work. Holmes paced slowly around the enclosure, each movement deliberate. He stopped near the patch of sawdust, knelt down, and lifted a splinter with his tweezers. He brought it to his nose, then up to the light. "Notice, Watson, the slight greenish tint. I suspect it's the trace of a chemical reaction. Not blood, not oil, but something less innocent. Lestrade, you might want to keep it for analysis." The inspector grunted, took out an envelope, and obeyed. He was now too seasoned to ignore Holmes's whims, too often trapped by the results. Holmes then approached the box. He didn't touch it, but circled above his prey like a hawk. "Observe the stitching," he whispered to me. "It's been filed, smooth but not too smooth. And look here, tiny marks like those of a tool not commonly found in a warehouse. What do you say, Watson?" I looked, but I only saw a slight irregularity. A scratch, perhaps. Holmes smiled faintly. Seeing is one thing, my dear friend. Observing is another. These are the marks of a scientific instrument, not those of a carpenter's chisel. We are dealing with an educated man. He straightened up, and his gaze swept over Quaint, Henning, Vogel, and Cobb in turn. Each of them moved anxiously under his eye, but I couldn't determine if it was from guilt or simply because of the strange light. An unexpected interruption. Our investigation might have continued in this way had it not been for a sudden clamour outside the door, a boy's cry, the hurried clatter of boots. Cobb strode out and returned pulling a thin young man by the collar, his face pale beneath a shock of sand-coloured hair. "It's Bell," he grumbled, "the messenger. I caught him lurking near the drain down there." The boy, barely 16 years old, writhed in her embrace. "I wasn't doing any harm. I was just watching." "What are you looking for?" Holmes asked softly. The boy glanced at Vogel, who frowned, and at Quaint, whose ruddy face had paled to a mottled pink. Then he swallowed hard. "For the man who limps, sir," he murmured. Holmes' eyes flashed. "Ah, so you saw it too?" "Yes, sir, 2 nights ago. He gave me a shilling to watch Bridger approach the back door. He said he wanted to measure the pipes, but Bridger caught me talking to him, and the following night—" He broke off, shivering. The warehouse fell into silence, broken only by the faint buzzing of insects coming from the glowing cartridge. Holmes's voice, when it was heard, was calm, almost compassionate. "You did well, my boy. Don't be afraid. The rest is up to us." Holmes' summary. As we left the warehouse, Holmes walked beside Lestrade, speaking quietly but rapidly. "We have 4 characters on the scene, Inspector. Practically the superintendent, whose anxiety is more collective than personal; Vogel, the German foreman, who knows more than he lets on; Cobb, the guard, who fears what he cannot comprehend; and Bell, the boy, who has been bribed. But looming over them is the shadow of the lame man. Find him, and you will discover the mind behind this scheme."
"And what about the lantern itself?" asked Lestrade. Holmes's gaze returned to the object. The pale light spread into the distance, indifferent to the men who trembled before it. "This, Inspector," he said, "is only the mask. The face behind it is human, and that's where our net must fall." We stepped back into the frigid October air, the fog hanging low over the courtyard. Holmes clutched his coat and hailed a cab. His eyes were shining, and I knew the chase had truly begun. "Watson," he said as we mounted our horses, "we must pay a visit this evening to Clerkenwell. There is a jeweler there whose safe has been opened without a scratch. I imagine that the same hand that forged silence upon steel may also have drawn light from brass. It is time we made his acquaintance." Chapter 4. The Lame Man. Holmes's decision to steer our taxi towards Clerkenwell on that damp October evening filled me with a mixture of surprise and anticipation. It had been a long day. Our inspection of the Shoreditch warehouse, Lestrade's reluctant involvement, the anxiety of the superintendent and his German foreman, and above all, that supernatural glimmer that still haunted my mind. Yet Holmes, as always, seemed all the more invigorated by the complexity of the puzzle. "The robbery of the jeweler and Clerkenwell, Watson," he said as we settled into the taxi seat as we drove east, "was, at first glance, a routine case, yet it is full of interesting details.
A safe opened without the slightest dent or scratch on the lock. No ordinary burglar could achieve that. It smacks of expertise, and expertise combined with experience. You suspect, I said, that the same hand that designed this luminous device also found a way to open a jeweler's safe. Exactly. The world, my dear friend, is shrinking every year. Inventors no longer expend their energy in cloisters or laboratories. Some exercise their genius in less prestigious fields. The streets narrowed as we entered Clerkenwell. The street lights were on, casting uncertain glows on the puddles and cobblestones, while the fog lingered in low slicks like the smoke of an unseen fire. We stopped in front of a small shop with its shutters half closed. Inside, a stout figure in shirt-sleeves was talking to a policeman. "This is Mr. Elkins, the jeweler," murmured Holmes. "Let's hear his story." The jeweler's account. Elkins, a man with a flowery appearance and a large belly, greeted us with all the exasperation of a merchant who has told his story too many times. "Gentlemen, you can look as much as you like, but I assure you there's no trace on the safe, none at all. I left at 10, I came back at 6, and 3 trays of rings had disappeared. No forced windows, no forced locks, as if the jewels had flown out of the box." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet, Mr. Elkins," he said, "things rarely work without legs. May I examine the safe?" The jeweler led us to the back, where a heavy iron box was bolted to the wall. Holmes examined the lock, his telescope pressed against his chest, his long fingers hovering above it, without ever touching it. He muttered occasionally, his brows furrowed, his nose almost touching the steel. Finally he straightened up, his eyes shining. "Watson, look, no scratches, that's true, but here do you see a slight discoloration at the seam?" I leaned over. "A dull grayish stain like smoke." "No smoke, heat applied gently. The lock was softened, not forced. A device, perhaps similar to the one in Shoreditch, was used. It releases concentrated energy without a flame." Elkins groaned. "What are these devilish tricks? What honest man can resist such infamy?" Holmes placed his hand on his arm. "Rest assured, sir, every device bears the signature of its creator. I'm already beginning to read this man's palm." The lame shadow. We had barely left the shop when Holmes, who was scanning the street with hawks-like focus, grabbed my sleeve. "Watson, there!" Through the fog I glimpsed a tall, thin figure walking unevenly along the far sidewalk. He was leaning on a cane, his right leg trailing slightly behind him. A cap was pulled down over his forehead, and the collar of his coat was turned up to protect him from the cold. "The lame one," murmured Holmes. "Come, Watson, we mustn't lose him." We set off in pursuit, our footsteps muffled by the fog-damp stones. The man moved swiftly despite his disability, weaving through the narrow alleyways with surprising ease. One he stopped beneath a lamp to light a pipe, and I caught the sweet, heavy scent of Cavendish tobacco wafting back to us.
Holmes quickened his pace. "Just as I thought, the Marshlight artist has found new lairs." The chase led us into darker quarters, where ragged children loitered and women with painted faces called from doorways. Finally, the man entered a narrow courtyard and ascended the steps of a modest boarding-house. He glanced behind him, and though his gaze met ours only for a moment, I felt a thrill of recognition.
This was not a common vagrant, but an educated man, his features refined though ravaged by illness. He disappeared inside, closing the door firmly behind him. Holmes took me by the arm. "Not tonight, Watson. The bird is being cared for. We mustn't frighten it and take it out of its nest before we know how it's built." The next morning we found ourselves back at the same boarding house, a gloomy brick building with peeling paint and windows clouded by grime. A landlady with a face severe opened the door and observed us suspiciously until Holmes presented us with a sovereign. "The gentleman who limps?" Holmes asked quietly. His face softened immediately. "Mr. Mortimer, as he introduces himself. A scholar, I would say, though as poor as a church mouse. He pays regularly, mind you, but lives quietly, keeps odd hours, and has packages delivered from scientific houses, glass tubes, electrical wires, bottles with strange smells. He gave me a hand once when one of them exploded and filled the stairwell with smoke." "Does he have any visitors?" "I only saw one, a foreigner, perhaps German, stocky and short. They talk at length in low voices. Once I heard the word picturesque, if that means anything to you." Holmes's eyes shone. "That's true. Thank you, madam. You've been a great help." As we walked away, Holmes's demeanor became more abstract. He tapped his stick on the pavement in time with his thoughts. A scholar, Watson, living in the shadows, conducting dangerous experiments. A German visitor, surely Herr Vogel, and the name Quant on their lips. The triangle begins to tighten. "Do you think this Mortimer invented the lantern?" "Almost certainly. The limp, the tobacco, the instruments, everything points to it. But the motive, that's the biggest mystery. Was it sabotage of the gas company by a competitor in the electricity sector? Theft, the use of his invention to silence locks, or a more personal plot born of desperation? And what about Bridger's death?" Holmes's face grew grave. "That, Watson, is the darkest point of it all. Whether he died by scientific accident or by the will of man, I cannot yet say. But the answer lies in Mortimer's apartments and in the consciences of those who visit him. A plan is established. That evening, while we were having dinner in our Baker Street lodgings, Holmes revealed his plan. "Tomorrow, Watson, we both will visit Mr. Mortimer under the pretext of a medical consultation. His limp provides us with a sufficient excuse. You will play the doctor, while I observe the laboratory. If he is indeed the craftsman of our lantern, there will be some clue within these walls. We must proceed with caution, for such a man can be desperate, and desperation allied with genius is the most formidable of adversaries." He leaned back, crossing his fingers, his eyes half closed. "Remember, Watson, the glow is only a symptom. The real disease is human, and soon we will explore its heart." Chapter 5. At Mr. Mortimer's. It was with a certain amount of anticipation that I accompanied Holmes the next morning to the squalid Clerkenwell district, where our lame friend had taken up residence. The fog had lifted, but the air remained damp and acrid, with a drizzle that smoothed the cobbles and made the horses' hoofs clatter on the greasy stones. Holmes, lost in a profound silence, his eyes half closed, his long fingers lightly drumming on his walking-stick as if rehearsing a mental symphony. "Holmes," I said finally, "do you really think that this man, Mortimer, is our culprit?" My dear Watson, I am not thinking of anything. I am observing. Mortimer may be the spider at the heart of this web, or simply the fly caught in someone else's thread. It is up to us to determine which. When we arrived at the guest house, it was even more dismal by day than by night. The bricks were blackened with soot, the stair railing greasy from years of use. The sharp-nosed owner greeted us without surprise, as if respectable-looking visitors were now part of her daily routine. "Mr. Mortimer is here, gentlemen, on the second floor at the back. I can't be held responsible for the smell, mind you. It makes the chamberladies sick."
Holmes gave me a mocking look. "Go ahead, Watson. You're the doctor, after all." I knocked, and an inner voice told us to come in. The room we entered bore the marks of both poverty and intellect. The furnishings were sparse: a narrow bed, a simple table, 2 worn chairs, but on every surface lay the remnants of experimentation. Glass tubes, spools of thread, damaged volumes of scientific treatises, and flasks filled with strange powders cluttered the table and shelves. A faint metallic odor hung in the air, mingled with the sweetness of Cavendish tobacco. The occupant rose from his chair by the fire and greeted us with a mixture of surprise and courtesy. He was a man of about 40, though illness and medical treatment had etched deeper wrinkles into his face. Tall but thin, he leaned heavily on a cane as he came to meet us. His right leg dragged behind him with a labored effort. His eyes, dark yet luminous, held that feverish glint that too often accompanies both genius and illness. "Are you a doctor, sir?" he said, addressing me eagerly. "The landlady told me you could come. Please, sit down. My cough is nothing, I assure you, but this leg burns like fire." I examined him briefly, noting the pallor of his skin, his hollow cheeks, his rapid and shallow breathing. He was clearly suffering from a debilitating illness, perhaps tuberculosis, and his limp suggested an old bone or nerve injury. "You need to rest, Mr. Mortimer," I said gently, "and as for your cough, avoid the fumes from your chemicals. They won't do you any good." He chuckled. "Chemistry is my whole life, doctor. Without it, I would have no reason to rise above it. You see before you a man ruined by illness, but sustained by a single spark of invention." The role of Holmes. While I was discussing these matters with the patient, Holmes wandered quietly around the room, seemingly absorbed in examining the books and apparatus. He lifted a spool of wire, peered into a glass retort, and delicately sniffed a corked bottle. His demeanor expressed courteous curiosity, but I knew perfectly well that he was actively cataloguing every detail. At one point, he stopped near the window, where a square of fabric was draped over a small object. With apparent nonchalance, he pulled the fabric aside and revealed a brass cylinder no bigger than a teacup, with a curious opening at one end. Mortimer jumped violently. "Please, sir, don't touch that." Holmes bowed his head gravely. "I wouldn't even dream of it. A model of your invention, perhaps." Mortimer slumped back in his chair, his face suddenly vacant. "A toy, nothing more. The world isn't ready. The company, the electricity company, they'd laugh or worse. Yet I dreamed of giving London an inexhaustible, smokeless, eternal light. Instead, it brought me nothing but suspicion." "Suspicions?" Holmes' tone was gentle. Mortimer brought a trembling hand to his forehead. "I've been watched. Men are following me in the streets. Last week, a man named Bridger, a guard, spied on me by the river.
The next day he approached me, accusing me of tampering with the company's pipes, and now I hear he's dead. The man's voice broke, and he turned away, coughing violently. When it subsided, he murmured hoarsely, "I swear to you, gentlemen, that I had nothing to do with it. If my invention caused him harm, it was by bad luck, not malice." It was then that Holmes, under the pretext of tidying a stack of books, made a subtle movement that escaped Mortimer, but not me. He had slipped a folded piece of paper between the pages of a volume and hidden it in his pocket with the deftness of a magician. His face remained impassive, his manner unchanged, but I knew that moment that he had discovered a crucial clue that he was choosing for the time being not to reveal to me, not even to me. "Mr. Mortimer," said Holmes at last, "your invention is remarkable, but such genius should not be wasted in a dwelling like this. May I return, accompanied by one or two scholars who might better appreciate your work?" Mortimer's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and fear. "If you believe they won't betray me, then yes, but come quickly, for I don't have long to live." Holmes bowed. "We will return, sir. In the meantime, take care of your health." We took our leave and descended the filthy stairs. Once in the street, I turned to my companion. "Holmes, what do you think of him? He struck me as an unfortunate visionary, more deserving of pity than suspicion."
Holmes hailed a taxi and gestured for me to get in before answering. His eyes shone with restrained excitement, but his lips formed that enigmatic smile that both fascinated and enraged me. "My dear Watson," he said, "we have seen a sick man endowed with a glittering toy and a guilty conscience. But does the guilt lie in what he has done, or in what others? Did they force him to do it? That's the question. For now, let's be content with what we've learned." "And what have we learned?" I asked. Holmes simply patted his pocket where the stolen paper lay. "This, my dear friend, must remain my secret for the time being. Tensions are rising." His evasiveness irritated me, but I couldn't deny the emotion that always accompanied the feeling that he had seen more than I had, that a subtle thread was already in his hands, even if it remained invisible to my eyes. We returned through the fog-shrouded streets, and I thought again with concern of Mortimer's pale face, his trembling hands, and his desperate protestations of innocence. If Holmes was right, then in those squalid rooms lay the key to Bridger's death, the strange glowing lantern, and perhaps even the future of London's illumination. Yet how fragile, how pitiful seemed the man who could wield such power, sick, friendless, hunted. Holmes, as if reading my thoughts, suddenly said, "Don't waste your sympathy too soon, Watson. Genius can inspire pity, but it can also inspire crime. Until we know which, let's keep our lantern lit and ready." After this enigmatic remark, he remained silent, leaving me to grapple with my own perplexities as the taxi took us once again towards Baker Street.